Welcome everybody to our bush broadcast on the wonderful Plains Wanderer. I must point out that that wonderful noise you heard just then was from a woodland dawn chorus, not from the Plains Wanderer, whose call is very discreet and very gentle. Now, I'd like to acknowledge that as I stand on Australian soil, I stand on Aboriginal land, and I'm joining you today from the Camaragal country on Sydney's North Shore. Tonight, we're going to be meeting two of my colleagues to talk about the wonderful Plains Wanderer. This is a special edition, and we're going to be looking at what it takes to keep the Plains Wanderer going in some very interesting landscapes. We've been fortunate to be able to share that wonderful film with you that I hope most of you had a chance to watch. It was written and directed by Michael Portway, and that's for an organisation called Remember the Wild. They use storytelling to bring experiences of the natural world back into our lives, which of course is what these bush broadcasts are all about. So if you haven't watched it yet, I strongly recommend you do. And there's a link and a password that was sent in the invitation, and it'll appear again in our chat very shortly. So tonight, to talk about the Plains Wanderer, I'm joined by our CEO, Heather Campbell, and our ecologist for Southeast Australia, Graeme Finlayson. Welcome, Heather. Welcome, Graeme. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Matthew.
So let's get cracking. Heather, first question to you. Tell us how we became involved in this film.
Thanks a lot, Matthew. And before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm currently sitting on Tarrabal and Yagara country. So I'm sitting in the edge of Brisbane at the moment. So not home to the Plains Wanderer up here, but the Plains Wanderer is found also in Queensland. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging of the land I'm standing on, but also the lands of all the places where we can find the Plains Wanderer. Sorry, this is my prop. This is as close as I've got so far, which is a soft toy Plains Wanderer, and he travels or she travels with me across the country. So how we got involved, I think a key thing was Remember the Wild were doing some filming at Bulkamata, and they're fascinated by the story of the Plains Wanderer and wanting to pull together a story that pulled together all the partners, the conservationists, the farmers, the human element around this amazing species, and actually fighting, for a species so that it doesn't become extinct. And I think that's really important for us as an organisation, is it's all about partnerships. It's all about how we work together as the conservationists, as farmers and landholders and land managers, but also with the zoo organisations that are breeding up Plains Wanderers, and how we work together both in the scientific recovery team, but also as a community. Because this is super cute, and we'll share some visuals, and Graeme will talk through more about the bird. But there's also some great little snippets of videos that you can find from some of the different zoo organisations that are breeding the bird, and it's fascinating. The first time I was lucky enough to be at Melbourne Zoo at Werribee, where they're breeding them, and they were showing me the enclosures, and I'm going, but it's just dirt and these few tufts of grass. And I just couldn't mentally get it through my mind is, why would a bird want to hang out in that? Just looked like a really inhospitable area. So I find it fascinating, which is why this bird comes with me for trips. And I'm really interested in having the conversation and hearing more of the insights from Graeme. And I'm hoping that you really enjoyed watching the movie. I found it fascinating, the different voices and hearing the different ways that people were engaged and how it had captivated people. So it's all about that. And for us with our strategy, as we look to 2030, it's about partnerships. It's about building those relationships. And the slide that we've just put up talks about our vision for 2030. We want to deepen and double our impact. And we'll do that across our reserves. And we know that we have Plains Wanderers at Bulkamata, at Pilanga, at Pullen Pullen. So our work on our reserves, but also our work on those other areas with Aboriginal partners, and they're really important for us in the partnership areas that we operate, and across the agricultural lands. And you would have seen in the film how important it was to those farmers up in northern Victoria that they had Plains Wanderers. So you would have seen on this slide that the Plains Wanderer has bounced into the different landscapes. This is where you find it across Australia. And it's across those different priority landscapes that we operate in, from the arid areas of South Australia and Bulkamata, from that riverina goldfields, northern part of Victoria, into southern New South Wales, and then up round the desert properties of Pigalunga and then across to Pullen. So it's an amazing bird that is found in quite different environments. And I'm really looking forward to Graeme sharing some insights of this fascinating bird.
Thanks, Heather. And if people have questions as we go through the webinar tonight, please chuck them into the chat, where we'll be responding to them towards the end of the webinar. And also, I forgot to remind people that if they'd like to let us know in the chat who they are and which country they're joining us from, if they know that, then it'd be lovely to see that. So please do chuck that into the chat. So now let's talk to a man who has actually met a plains wanderer up close. And Graeme, I know you're a bit of a fan of this little bird. Can you tell us a bit about your background as an ecologist and why this bird's so special to you?
Sure, Matt. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. And I'll just like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from Paramount country in the Adelaide Hills, where, yes, also there's no plains wanderers here, but luckily I too have a prop. They're joining me. So I started work with Bush Heritage in late 2017 as the South Australian rangelands ecologist. My background has more been in mammal ecology, but I've also done lots of general surveys for reptiles and small mammals across all sorts of parts of Australia. When I joined Bush Heritage, my first visit out to Bulkamata was in February 2018, and that was sort of the start of a really long dry period out in that area. And certainly, yeah, it was a little bit depressing, I suppose, at times as to how dry it was, and we'd had yeah, sort of very little rainfall leading up to that first trip, and it was super hot. And I'd heard a bit about the plains wanderer, obviously, and that it had been recorded quite a bit at Bulkamata. And so I went out spotlighting, looking for it, and had no luck at all. And then after a year and a half, and I'd got involved with the recovery team, and I'd installed some song meters out there because we knew that they were another way of detecting the species, which we might get into a bit later on as well. Still didn't pick up any calls, still didn't see birds after hours and hours of spotlighting and looking around out on the plains. And then in May 2019, I was changing the cards over with Andrea Scherner, who was living at Bulkamata. Her husband Kurt was the reserve manager at the time, and we stumbled across three plains wanderers that were just bunkered down in. Well, the photograph that was on the first slide actually was from that sighting, and so that was one of those moments when you're doing this kind of work in the wild where you're just blown away by this encounter, and it was yeah, one of my most exciting moments in the field, given that we'd put so much time into searching for them and had song meters out. Anyway, we continued with the nocturnal surveys and the song meters, and unfortunately still didn't pick up any calls. The work we're doing out there, we've also recently managed to find a PhD student, Saskia Gerhardy, who's I think on the call today watching. So yeah, Saskia's just started a PhD, and I guess the most exciting thing has been since late 2020 when that drought broke. We've started to get calls on the song meters, and we've started to encounter birds when we're out doing these nocturnal surveys. And I guess timing wise, that's great for Saskia because it means she's not spending 3 years looking for something. She's actually managed to find a couple. So so this is hopefully the start of some research that we'll be able to find out a lot more about a species that we know very little about in these parts of its range.
The bit of video that was playing just there, Graeme, seemed to indicate how challenging it is to find these little birds. It's very dark and it's a very small bird, isn't it? Creeping through the grass.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So Can you tell us a bit about the type of work that you're involved with at ground level to support these populations? Because that involves a number of different types of landholders, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're still trying to piece together why bull comata is kind of a hotspot in South Australia for the bird. When we acquired the property, that was a big part of the reason why it was acquired by Bush Heritage. The area on the open plains country is really poorly represented in the National Reserve network. It's been heavily impacted by agriculture, and yeah, there's sort of, it was identified as an important bird area, and that included there'd been previous sightings on bull comata and stations either side of us, but for some reason, yeah, bull comata seem to have these hotspot areas where the birds would just turn up. So the work we're doing, I guess, focuses on some of the threats to this species and to other species that occur in these ecosystems. So managing predators, so feral cats and foxes, and also trying to improve the habitat that's available in the area through grazing management. So obviously we've removed domestic stock from our properties, but also trying to increase community awareness in the region. So we're active members of the NRM type groups that gather, and we catch up with neighbours and discuss these projects that we're doing. And then the research side of it is what I've mentioned earlier, that Saskia's started as a PhD, is trying to find out ways we can improve the detection of the species. So using different forms of technology like thermal rather than spotlighting is proving to be far more effective to find birds like plains wanderers, but also other species on these open plains areas. And then improving the way we use the song meters as well. So at the moment, we've had song meters deployed in a grid-like system, but we might look to move them more frequently, or move them into areas that we identify as habitat that's got those same characteristics as the species where we're finding it.
Fantastic. And the song meters you're talking about are they're fairly sophisticated bits of equipment, aren't they? And I believe they switch on automatically in the evening, don't they? So they're not running during the day, if you want them to do that for nocturnal birds.
Yeah, at the moment we've got them set on a dawn and dusk. So there's an hour just on dusk and an hour just on dawn, and that has been sort of the setting that has been used in other parts of the bird's range where they've been successful in picking up the recordings. Equally, I know from some of the captive populations that the birds are calling throughout the day and at different times. So that's another thing we've been thinking about as to whether we actually deploy some song meters at different times of the day. But I think the other bonus of that call schedule is that it's the contrast of the call to surrounding noises that makes it easier to pick up during those recording times.
Yeah, fantastic. And in terms of analysis on those song meters, whose job is it? Is it yours or Saskia's to sit and listen through 8 to 10 hours of not very much, or frog croaking or cricket chirping, or do you get help from technology?
So luckily technology has come to the party. We use, I was using a program called Kaleidoscope, which is used for a lot of other species around the world with acoustics monitoring. The most probably readily known species that are detected with these types of devices are bats. And then you can recognize, you can use computer algorithms to recognize call profiles. So luckily for us, because of the species, conservation status, the Plains Wanderer Recovery Team have developed a call recognition file, which can be run against all of the recordings that come in, and it gives you all the calls with some level of confidence that it thinks are plains wanderers. And in the 2 years where I was looking at the data for bull comata, there was a lot of blowflies that it thought might have been plains wanderers. So what it gives you a bunch of calls that it thinks are plains wanderer, and then you have to verify them manually. So that's now been Saskia's life for the past couple of months since she started. but it's a really accurate recognition file, so it's quite useful. And then the other part of that story is we're hoping that we can develop some call recognition for other species and
Fantastic.
look at those species as a more of a whole of ecosystem approach to look at, you know, responses to drought and things like that in these landscapes.
Excellent. And we've had a question come in from Hazel about the you know, what sort of sounds interfere with the recordings during the daylight, and I'd imagine that's, you know, a lot of the fact that there's a lot of wind in the day compared to the still of the night, isn't there? So the wind sounds and grasses and crickets and lots of other things.
Yeah, lots of other things, but also the Plains Wanderer call is a really low sort of monotonous sort of, it's actually really difficult to hear at times. And I think just on dawn and just at dusk is the difference in the frequency. It seems to be able to pick up those calls better. I think that's the theory behind it. I'm not an acoustics expert by any stretch, but my understanding is that's why it's so useful at those times of the day. So if you're recording it during the middle of the day, I think, yeah, there's a lot of other noise going on, other birds, the wind, all sorts of things. And in Victoria, even cows have been sort of flagged as potential plains wanderers. So it's that really low call that
sounds like a cow's tummy.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I wanted to also ask you, we've been suffering in the southeast and across Australia lots of floods and fire and drought. What do these, you know, typical and atypical variations in climate, what sort of effect have these been having on plains wanderers? Have we learned something about, you know, their distribution and how that's affected by, you know, extremes like that in the weather?
I think at the moment our idea is that habitat modification and probably introduced pests have been the biggest impact on the species. They used to occur, as hopefully most of you have got to see the film, they used to occur on the Adelaide Plains, and the distribution based on observations across South Australia, they're scattered right across South Australia in various parts. And I think, yeah, it's habitat modification and removing naturally occurring grasslands has been the biggest impact on the species. In terms of the predictions for climate, I think drought clearly had an effect on the population being present at Bulkamata, but we really don't know that much about them, and that's why I'm excited that we've got a PhD student now who's going to focus on the bird and hopefully be able to put some trackers on them and see, well, what happens, how are they using the open plains at Bulkamata at a local scale, but also what happens to them, where do they go, how big are their movements when they take off at the end of a wet cycle. We know they were there in the middle of the drought, but they're obviously in lower numbers, and they've seemed to have come back in greater numbers since that drought broke. So these are all things we need to find out. I think long term, there's some predictions for places like Bulkamata that are relatively scary when it comes to climate change predictions. So having longer heat waves, longer drought, less rainfall, and changed rainfall patterns at different times of the year, which will affect the presence of the vegetation types that are there. So we really do need to find out, well, what are the key habitat requirements of the species, and what can we do to intervene if these things do change dramatically.
Fantastic. Well, it's good to know there is a recovery team and that it's in safe hands on our reserves. And equally, as you saw in the film, that there are a lot of other landowners, farmers, pastoralists who are keen to have their little bird continue. So thanks for chatting with us. We've got a nice time now where we can handle some of the questions that have been coming up. So if the film or anything that Heather or Graeme have talked about in the last half an hour or so have brought any questions to mind, please chuck them into the chat. A couple have come up, and I was going to ask a question which links to one of these ones, which is, there are some captive breeding populations, aren't there, Graeme, which are part of the recovery team. And one of the questions we had is, one of our callers, Helen, has said that she knows king quail and that they're calling and peeping to each other all the time. I don't know if this is something you're familiar with, but the question was, are the plains wanderers chatty? You mentioned they call during the day, so we all love the plains wanderer. It's a very cute bird, and I love the idea of them chatting away to each other, and then as soon as they're out on reserve and you've put a song meter up, they go really quiet and don't say anything. So
there's some really sophisticated facilities at some of the zoos. So near us, Monarto Zoo has a little captive colony of plains wanderers that have come from Victoria, from Zoos Victoria out at Werribee, which is also a fantastic facility. And Dubbo also has a great little facility that they're using some of the birds from there to release in parts of New South Wales. The colony at Monarto Zoo has 24/7 surveillance cameras set up, and the videos are, it's incredible to watch because they don't stop still for very long. They do vocalize a bit. I wouldn't say they chat as much as what I understand king quails do. Yes. But they're just constantly moving around, and the little behaviors they're exhibiting are just, they're just incredible to watch, like really captivating actually. Like they just jump up in the air and they spread their wings and do these little flutters, and there's all sorts of little behaviors, a lot of which we're probably not 100% sure what it means, but I suspect, it is some form of communication at times. And one of the things we're keen to use the captive birds for are learning more about some of these behaviors, learning more about the interaction between birds, and also learning, well, are these birds sort of ready for release into the wild? So could we look at the captive birds to figure out if they're averse to being scared by predators and things like that? Because when you see them out in the wild, you just think these things have no hope. But I think they're so well camouflaged, and they seem to somehow be able to avoid predation. But I was going to say, one of the little videos I know that was at the Monarto Zoo, a willy wagtail came up to the edge of the front of the aviary, and this plains wanderer got completely freaked out by this willy wagtail. So, yeah.
Well, we all know how aggressive willy wagtails are. They'll take on anything, won't they?
Yeah. Sorry,
Heather, did you have a question?
Yeah, no, sorry guys. I'm just, fascinated. I was lucky enough to see the aviary set up at Werribee Zoo, and I remember the scientists at the zoo basically saying, "Oh, it could take us 10 years to get these birds to breed in captivity. It could take ages. It could be a long process." And then suddenly they started breeding, and there's no stopping of them. So I'm just wondering, is that being experienced at the other captive breeding areas, Graeme? And they just seem to be, quite prolific when they're in the right habitat.
I think so, but I don't have the definitive answer on that. Sorry. But...
Yeah, no, it's just captivating. But I think I should be quiet now, Matthew, because there's a swathe of questions coming through for us now, which will be great.
Yes, I'll see if I can bring these together. There's 2 or 3 here, Graeme, that are asking about optimal vegetation for the plains wanderer, and I'll give you all 3 of the questions because I think you may be able to answer them together. Is there any specific ecosystem restoration work that can encourage the return of natural grasslands? That's the natural habitats. And there was also a question about controlling weeds where you've got sheep grazing, particularly on the Patho Plains area, and is that a challenge? And also a question about the film, which was, there was a comment on the density of the grass, and that's got to be just right. Does that mean that because we're getting plains wanderers at Bulkamata, that we've reached what I think Henry said is a Goldilocks level, which I think, Henry, by that you mean perfect, just the sweet spot for them. Is it just right at Bulkamata? Perhaps you could respond a little bit to that, those 3.
Yeah, well, and in the film, I think they did explain it pretty well about the level of grasses and how they're managing some of these smaller areas in Victoria. But the bird, based on what we understand, the birds seem to prefer something that's not grazed down to the bare nothing and isn't grown too high, so that they're in between. So some balance of grazing is really important. Just on that, there was a recent study that's come about because of some radio tracking studies in Victoria, that actually questions that to a little degree. So a lot of what we know about the birds is based on nocturnal surveys, which is when the birds are roosting. So we know a lot about their sort of roosting habitat preferences. During the day, they're really difficult to find, and we know less about them in those periods of time. So this radio tracking sort of showed that they're actually using some areas that we didn't think they liked in the past. And so that's what we're hoping to do in places like Bulkamata. In terms of the vegetation structure at Bulkamata, we're still, after the drought, there were very few grasses to be found out on the plains. A lot of small chenopod's and sclerulinas and some of these little chenopod's, but not that many grasses left after the drought. After the rain, there have been some grasses come back, but they're nothing like what would be an intact grassland in places like Victoria, where you've got 3 or 4 times the amount of rainfall. So again, I think what we think about plains wanderer ranging behaviour is that they typically have a very small home range, and in places like Victoria, where their preference is intact, or as close to intact grassland as there can be, they get their resources in a much smaller area than perhaps they would get in a place like Bulkamata. So our theory would be that at a place like Bulkamata, they'll move a lot further in their home range to get what they need to survive. So I suspect, the grasses will probably be, they're always going to be more sparse, and they'll be able to move a lot further to sort of make the most of that.
Fantastic. Well, that partially answers a question we had from Gary McDonald before the webinar, who kindly sent this in, which was asking about, do we have a sense of minimum patch size or area of habitat necessary to maintain I guess, a stable population that needs to interbreed? But I guess that's challenging and depends a lot on all those variables you just mentioned.
Yeah, and mainly from the Victorian birds, so the pathoplanes is where they've been most well studied. And we're hoping that we can put some pieces of the puzzle together about what we're calling these peripheral areas like South Australia and Queensland.
Fantastic. And I think also, in mentioning the different heights of the grass, Chris asked, or commented that from the film there was the evidence that the birds, don't really like long grass after rain, which is understandable because you're going to get wet if you move through it. So, and your comments about, most of our work being nocturnal, there's probably a lot still to learn about the birds, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely.
In that respect, which is fantastic. Well, there's a couple of other questions. And this is almost like a Dorothy Dixer, and I do apologise, Graeme, but I can't resist it. But the question has been, what is the risk of running over the birds and nests when driving out on country, and how do you control that? And I believe you have some personal near experience of that.
Well, the 3 birds that we found in the middle of the drought were they were just sitting on a track, and I think Heather a few times in meetings has been happy to sort of introduce me as someone who nearly ran over a plains wanderer, and I'll actually dispute that. I did see the bird before I stopped and thought, but there is a risk. All these ground nesting birds, there's a risk that you will drive over a nest, and I guess for us, the nocturnal surveying we're doing are on predefined paths that we've sort of mapped out, and we drive at about 10 kilometers an hour and go really slowly, and we're looking constantly. We've got someone else in the car, so we do our best to avoid that. Touch wood, to date, I'm not aware that we've run over a nest or a bird, and from what I've heard from the Victorian crew, it's similar. It hasn't happened under their watch, but absolutely there's potential that could happen. So sticking to these paths and following the same routes and things like that are critical.
And I guess that's one of the factors that the recovery team, which is made up of a lot of different individuals all concerned about the bird, one of their challenges is always education, isn't it? And how to assist people and communicate, how to look after them. So the fact that there's a variety of different landholders now invested in looking after this bird means that they that work can continue through them. And that leads on to a question I wanted to ask for Heather, which is, how important do you find, and Graeme, you may want to add in as well, how important are these partnerships with other organisations who are collaborating with traditional owners, farmers? You know, how vital is that in protecting a species like the plains wanderer?
Oh, look, I think it's critical. We're dealing with huge landscapes, lots of different, land tenures, and people will have different knowledge sets. Traditional owners, obviously, from 60,000 years of knowledge, local farming landholders from their generation and previous generations that may have seen them. So I think it's critical because none of us can do this alone. The only way that we can save species is actually all working together with our different skills, different landscapes, and that's why things like captive breeding is also important as well, because it helps us to understand at a closer level a lot of the traits related to the bird, and then how we can translate that out into the field. So I think it's critical. Everything that Bush Heritage does, we don't do alone. We always do in partnership. It's the only way to operate.
Fantastic. And Graeme, you experience this in your day-to-day work, don't you, in terms of collaborating and working with people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the film actually captures a lot to me what Bush Heritage are about. We, the two properties we have management of in South Australia are just, this small plot in a pastoral landscape. And that will be like that for a long, long time. We're surrounded by predominantly sheep farmers. At Bulkamata, we're lucky enough that we've got a neighbouring conservation reserve, and to our north, we've got a property that hasn't been stocked for a while that's owned by a mining company. So we've got lots of different stakeholders that a lot of whom want to care for the country as well, and they care about these species, and hearing stories about these species really gives them a buzz. And I think the film captured that beautifully. The couple who have lived and worked on the land for their entire lives, for them, seeing this bird is still just a massive buzz. They go out and think, I hope I see a plains wanderer tonight. And they've been involved with the recovery team. And I've found this recovery team to be such an amazing mix of people, and the bird has brought all them together. And that's, to me, is a pretty amazing part of species conservation work.
That's fantastic. And there's a couple of technical questions, Graeme, which is around our knowledge of the plains wanderer, and that's do we understand the importance of water to them? And the other question, that was from Henry. Thanks, Henry. And the other question was, in their name, wander, are we talking about their ability to move, as so many Australian birds do, in response to food and climate and water conditions? But the question from Craig, I think, is, are they active flyers? Do they migrate, or is their mode of transport, primarily walking?
I'll start with that one first. That they definitely can fly, and they fly very well. And our theory is that during times of drought and low productivity in these areas, sort of in the peripheral of their range, they sort of contract back to the more high rainfall areas like the Patho Plains. We do have 3 genetic samples from South Australian birds that were included in a broader study of the population genetics. And the South Australian birds sit in really closely to the New South Wales and Victorian birds. So it would seem that they're just moving out to these areas when times are okay. In terms of water, we don't really know that much about them, but given their habitat preference and their diet, I don't think it plays a major part in where they occur.
Yes. Okay. Now, there was a question also about their relationship to other birds. And it's mentioned in the film, I think, isn't it, that their closest relationship is to the seed snipes in South America. The question was asking whether that we've learned anything more. Do we have a better understanding of where their interesting characteristics come from? And I'm sorry, it's another very technical question, and probably is in the we don't know yet basket. But
yeah, no, we don't really know. But that's probably part of the reason that and I think this was touched on in the film as well. It's part of the reason that they are so special. They're completely unique, and we estimate that there's around 1,000 left, and if we lose them, that's a complete genus gone, not just species. So that uniqueness is part of what makes them so important for all these people working on them to try and save them.
Yes, indeed. And a question perhaps for you, Heather, which is if, as and when opportunities to purchase properties, adjacent to Bush Heritage reserves or close to come up, is that something Bush Heritage would consider in order to support through acquiring more habitat that would benefit the Plains Wanderer?
Look, and certainly, and it's one of the things that we're always looking to do. And if we look at that earlier map that we had up, which had the little Plains Wanderers on it, is there's different landscapes we're looking at. How do we actually shore up those areas? How do we actually connect in the landscape so that species can move, particularly as things warm up? So we would look at it, but around existing reserves. So particularly where we've got, and it's that great picture there, the South Australian, reserves, how can we shore them up? And as Graeme said, it's great given some of the neighbouring properties that we have at Bilkamata, but also where the Plains Wanderer exists up in the Mulligan area, which is that southwest Queensland, as well as the Mitchell Grasslands area. How can we actually make sure that we shore up habitat for the Plains Wanderer and for other species? So far, where we operate in Victoria is not quite Plains Wanderer habitat, but these birds have come, they've appeared in weird and wacky areas. I do know of one that I think appeared in a backyard in Ballarat or Bendigo at one stage. So it's amazing where they turn up, but certainly we want to look to purchase land where it makes sense or work with others to make sure that there's those corridors, there's those greater areas where these species can thrive.
Fantastic. And there was a nice question from Erica, which was about the captive breeding populations that we mentioned earlier. And Heather, you may know this from your association with Zoos Victoria. And the question is, will these birds eventually be released into either, reserves such as the ones Bush Heritage owns or other areas, to augment the populations or where they've declined or disappeared from? Because they did used to range as far north as Northern Territory, didn't they, and into Queensland, across bits of South Australia, a much broader distribution than we think they currently have.
Yeah, look, I think the aim with any captive breeding is to be able to augment populations out in the wild. And it's also obviously an insurance population if something happened and they were to crash in the wild. So there's always that desire to be able to reintroduce species. And I must admit, and Graeme, I think I've said to you, I might have said to the CEO, to the zoo, we'd quite happily take some more. So it's, but there's quite rightly a whole lot of really detailed scientific work that needs to be done before any species is translocated out into the wild. But certainly that would be the aim of all of this captive breeding. But Graeme, you might want to add some stuff from the experience that you have as well.
Yeah, so they have released some birds from captive colonies in Victoria. And initially they didn't do too badly, but I think a number of them were taken by predators. And more recently, there were some releases of birds up into a national park in New South Wales. And again, they released them into an area where they knew there were some existing Plains Wanderers, but it was at the end of the drought up there as well, and sort of coming into what they've now got as better season. And they also lost a number of the birds they released to predators as well. So yeah, the success of that, I guess the jury's still out, like a lot of reintroductions at an early stage or translocations at an early stage. But all the cogs in the recovery team are looking at options to do releases into areas. I know there's a lot of work going on in Victoria to try and acquire more properties that have some of this natural grassland left that haven't been cultivated. But yeah, I think at the moment the zoos are trying to stop them breeding because there's too many birds breeding. So we need to find more places to put them. But yeah, that's, as Heather mentioned, it's a long process to just get that to happen.
Well, perhaps they'll need to benefit from some of that predator aversion training, which we've been exploring in partnership, haven't we, at Bonbon and our partners, Arid Recovery, in terms of training the burrowing bettongs to avoid cats and foxes.
Yeah,
so some of those.
It's not a foreign thing for for captive animals in terms of training them for release. I know that some numbat breeding that happened at Perth Zoo many years ago, they were flying fake birds of prey over the top because, as some of you would know, numbats are out during the day, and that's a big risk for if a captive numbat had just had no idea what a bird of prey was, then they would have just been sitting there waiting to be preyed upon. So there's lots of little things that zoo programs and captive breeding programs do for trying to raise the awareness of their species to native and introduced predators.
Great. And Helen Tate had another question, which was, do we know what the feral cat numbers are like? And I guess Helen's question probably implies, are cats the main threat, or are there native predators, or is it cats and foxes, which are the usual culprits for small mammals and small birds?
Yeah, definitely. They're the two big ones out our way. We're lucky in a way at Bulkamata to be part of the Bounce Back footprint area. Bounce Back's a state government run program that focuses on removing feral animals from the landscape, and it's been a bit of a success story with species like yellow-footed rock wallabies in keeping fox numbers pretty much non-existent in certain areas. And the O'Leary Ranges is part of that, which borders onto Bulkamata. So foxes are at really low numbers throughout the district, and feral cat numbers have been quite low for the last few years, but they've definitely responded to the rain we've had and the increase of prey items for them. So yeah, they're part of our management program, and we do have people out there trying to trap them and deal with feral cats. So yeah, they've definitely increased since the break in the season.
Yes, fantastic. Well, I think we've covered most of the questions that our listeners have put into the chat session. So there was one I was going to ask you, Graeme, because as you know, I'm a bit of a birder and I haven't seen a plains wanderer yet, so I'm just a tad envious. How'd you get to see one, apart from twisting your arm?
Well, I think the most reliable place to see them in the wild is in Victoria through the Patho Plains. David Baker Gabb, who was featured in the film,
yes,
did do some early surveys at Bulkamata for plains wanderers, and he sort of did the sums on how long it took him to find a plains wanderer in Victoria compared to how long it took him to find a plains wanderer in South Australia. And the initial estimates that he had were it takes about, I think, an hour in Victoria when you're out spotlighting to find a bird, compared to 40 hours out in South Australia. So if you come to South Australia and want to find one, you just have to be prepared to put in the long hours. Yes. I think there are places in Victoria where you can be part of tours, but yeah, I'm not aware of those.
No, I have come across some commercial operators, and I suspect that's the best way for anybody who might be a bird fan on the webinar and wanting to see one. I think the commercial operators have their favourite spots, don't they, with a reasonable chance of actually seeing them.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing is some of these zoos may well look at having some on display in the future, but I know at the moment it's been pretty much behind closed doors as part of the captive breeding. So.
Fantastic. Well, we're pretty much at time, so thanks everybody for joining in this evening. This timing has been a bit different to our normal Bush broadcast, so please let us know if this works for you. I appreciate it's into sort of early evening and meal time, and I hope a few of you have had some drinks to support you. But thanks very much to Heather and to Graeme for sharing this time at the end of busy days. Great to hear about such a wonderful little bird, and as you may have guessed, I'm going to be planning how I can meet one in person at some point. So thank you very much, and just a quick mention that our next Bush broadcast is August, and it's going to be on the importance of biodiversity in agriculture, and that's going to be a really exciting webinar where we'll be talking about the pillar of our strategy that Heather mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, where we're looking to partner more closely with farmers because they own 58% of Australia. And if we want to look after and conserve some of the amazing animals and plants that call Australia home, then we need to be doing it even more broadly. And I think the film about the Plains Wanderer has indicated just how important that is. So please join us. You'll get an invitation soon, and look forward to seeing you next time. And thanks again, Graeme and Heather.
Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it.
everyone.
Such a fascinating little bird.